This video is meant to teach about what ACAB means. It will talk about cops relating to capitalism and racism and the history behind everything. This video, as always, is focused on the US perspective since I am there. Without further ado, let's begin. ACAB means all cops are bad. Why? Because cops uphold profits, property, and bigotry. They first of all protect capitalism by upholding laws that capitalists in charge enforce. They protect profits by charging people more for robbing banks, CEOs, corporations, and higher-up individuals and institutions rather than people getting robbed on the street or people having their homes broken into. They protect property by protecting the bank rather than the grocery store, or the skyscraper rather than the homeless person begging at the entrance of it. And they protect bigotry and enforce it via what I am going to say next. Not only do they protect the rich, they discriminate against minorities and enforce laws against them. To understand this, you must understand history. Black people were taken to the US as slaves. Then, when they were freed, they still had to deal with discrimination and no protection. Then they had to deal with Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation, gentrification, and rejection of better resources for their living. Then the Civil Rights Movement happened. This provided national protection from discrimination and violence, but not at a state level. States that still had racist governors and officials still could have some of their own laws and them kept via having their courts filled with more racists. Even if they didn't have racist laws to enforce, they could still ignore common crimes or hate crimes committed against black people. While things have gotten better, having presidents and officials throughout the time of the Civil Rights Bill being passed that were racist and funded police departments or state governments that supported racist stuff have not made much gain possible, at least at a decent rate. When it comes to LGBTQ+ people, we still don't have a national law protecting us. While some states have definitely made progress, there's still the issue of police choosing not to help us or deal with hate crimes against us. There are barely any states, except 2 or 3, that ban laws that allow murder on the basis that someone was scared of a trans person or a gay person. Then there's Asian people who have had to deal with a lot of racism, especially while COVID-19 is happening. Then we have indigenous people who are barely even acknowledged, along with disabled and neurodivergent people. While all of these minorities have had gains that have made their existence better, they are still in no way still fully safe, especially depending on the area they're in. So what must be understood here is that since things haven't gotten better, or at least to the degree of cishet white people for those groups, the laws haven't been reformed enough to take account for the disadvantages that they face. There might not be clearly shown racist laws being enforced, but the people making crime laws and repealing other laws that protect them know what they're doing that hurts those groups. If you understand history and how it relates to today, then you understand why this stuff is bad. Cishet white people don't have to deal with the problems some of them do at their capacity or at all. If you do not recognize the problems, you should take the time to research them, and if you don't, you need to understand why people would be against what you say. With all of this, you'd probably also ask, well, what about the good ones? And to that I say, the quote-unquote good ones are usually silent in bad situations, or if they're actually trying to be helpful, they're punished. An example of such is Stephen Mater. He was dealing with a black teenager that was distressed and wanted him to kill him. Stefan tried to de-escalate the situation, but when backup arrived, the teenager raised the gun he had, and the officers fired and killed him. Stefan was fired weeks later for not killing the teenager himself. Another would be Carol Horn. She was responding to an officer in trouble, and when she arrived at the scene, she brought the handcuffed person being dealt with to the car. Before they got there, one of the officers put him in a chokehold when he wasn't even resisting. She tried to help by removing his arm from around the man, but she was then punched by the officer. She was then fired for interfering with an arrest. There are more cases of these things happening, but those were 2 that I could find. But what those cases also show and make happen is the blue wall of silence. The Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights is a code in 14 or so states that give cops protections. If a department doesn't have such a Bill of Rights, they are more or less put into police union contracts. These contracts usually have agreements that officers are not allowed to go against other officers in court or during arrest so that they can stay in their power positions. If you realize from the autopsy report from George Floyd a day or so ago before recording this, it claimed that Floyd died from medical conditions he already had rather than the fact he couldn't breathe while having a knee on his neck. The realization that you should have from that is that the officers worked to make sure that they weren't blamed for him dying. One such code in those bills and contracts is that an officer can only be questioned for a certain amount of time and must be questioned by fellow officers. As you can see, that is flawed because of the fact that those officers will probably not say anything so that they continue to stay in law enforcement. Police unions in those bills of rights make cops that want to speak out fear of losing their jobs and thus letting cops doing inexcusable actions get away. Those who do speak out are usually fired or retired before they say something. If you wonder why I believe that there are no good cops, it's usually because of those reasons. Those who commit their violent actions are in no way good. Those who are silent care about their jobs more than they care about justice, and those who do speak out are usually no longer cops. Protests are meant to promote change and make the system better most of the time. When they deal with protesters, they tend to use force. If we're talking about peaceful protests, they are usually met with force if they protest for too long. Such a protest would be the Kent State Massacre, where lives were lost, the UC Davis incident, where protesters that were sitting down were pepper sprayed, and the Occupy Wall Street protests, where people were marching and got beat with batons and tackled. There are, of course, many more of these incidents, but these are a few. When it comes to violence, such as stores and banks being torched and destroyed, the cops care more about those issues than trying to watch out for civilians. There have been constant protests that have been met with tear gas canisters to the face and batons whacked at people trying to leave protest areas that weren't even involved. Prime examples of those right now are the riots occurring, news reporters being fired at with rubber pellets for no reason, and a kid getting shot with a tear gas canister. Then you have peaceful protesters who were just marching and standing. They were trying to stop cops from keeping them back, so they used a barricade pushed against a cop car to then have another cop car come in for them both to ram into the crowd. Then there was tear gas used against other protesters that were just standing around cheering. There are many more incidents of cops ramming into protesters and tear gas being used, but those are just a few from recent events. Both ramming into people and using tear gas, something banned from warfare, is inexcusable. Cops use violence against protesters to get their way. They use violence so they can keep their power as officers. They don't want to lose that power, even if it means siding with protesters to get actual justice. To finish off this video, I hope you have learned something from this. I support you continuing to learn about this stuff. I've said it once and will say again, if you do not learn from this and do not continue research, do not be surprised if people are against and don't believe what you have to say. All cops are bad. Maybe not individually, but as a systematic problem. It doesn't matter if a cop is trying to serve their community and think they're doing good, they are still upholding laws and policies that are discriminatory and bigoted. And finally, my message that I want to say is that I fully support the protests happening. I support their methods and the people in them, besides the ones who are destroying black businesses, places that help their communities, and being violent against non-cops that aren't a threat. Mind you, that part is not the entirety of the protests, but those small few still need to be called out. Solidarity, comrades, and black